Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started. Welcome and thank you all for attending this month's exchange call. My name is Troy Lanigan. I'm president of the Canada Strong and Free Network, formerly the Manning Center. I'm not going to introduce all of our panelists. You've got their bios that have been sent around because I want to get into our topic today. I will just quickly, though, introduce Colin Craig, who often joins us on these. He'll be looking into questions, different things people are discussing, and if he sees something, he'll bring that up as an issue. We have a great topic today. We have a great panel today, so this is going to be a really good discussion. This has been suggested as a topic for the last couple months, so I'm pleased that we're able to do this. And we're going to try a little bit more of an open format today. So if you've got your chat window open, the chat is open for everyone that's participating. If you want to click in questions directly to the chat, I've asked our guests to monitor and watch that. And if something's relevant to them while they're making their comments, they'll chime in on it. And so we'll see how that format goes for us as we work to make this more of an open exchange, even though we're online. So everyone, again, thank you, welcome, and appreciate you joining us. Let's get into this. First of all, sort of a 35,000-foot question, and we'll start for each of you, and that is, what's happened to the media over the past 20, even 30 years? And I want to focus more in this question on the legacy media. In the 1990s, I was a spokesman for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in British Columbia. Now, I'll remember that, you know, you'd put out a news release or somebody else would put out a news release, and they'd often get comments from both sides. You'd have more of a debate, of an exchange in terms of the reporting. But today, obviously, the media looks very different. It looks different in terms of what stories are selected, what's allowed to be discussed, who's allowed to comment. So the first question is, how did we get to where we're at today? And is media just simply a reflection of the broader cultural shifts? The output of what we see in our public institutions and other things in terms of some of the political correctness that we see endemic across our cultural institutions. So Ken Whyte, probably the most experienced in terms of background with the media of this group, why don't we start with you, because you've certainly seen the most or sat in the most chairs in terms of different perspectives on this question.
That's a polite way of saying I'm the oldest. Is that?
Oh, I'm the oldest.
No, happy to. I think two things have happened. The most important is that the business model of conventional media, especially magazines and newspapers, broke. Advertising disappeared, and that was for most publications somewhere between 70, 80, sometimes higher % of their revenue, and that threw them back on seeking revenue from their readers, customers, direct patrons, rather than from advertising. And the thing about having an advertising dominated medium is advertisers cared a lot about the advertising environment. The advertisers wanted everybody to be able to go into their local newspaper and feel comfortable there. They wanted the biggest possible audiences for their ads, and the publishers of newspapers and magazines were committed to giving people or giving advertisers a really good advertising environment that appealed to as broad a spectrum of people as possible. Newspapers before advertising became dominant back in the 19th century were all partisan. They relied for their incomes on their readers, and they played to their readers' political preferences, right, left, or whatever. And it was in the early 20th century when advertising became a big deal that stopped. Now that advertising's gone, we're starting to drift back into a more reader-driven and hence more engaged and partisan style of media. And the second thing that happened that really encouraged that as well was social media, which allowed everybody out there to have a voice. There were no longer gatekeepers that were saying that one person could comment and many thousands of others couldn't. And people, as they got accustomed to social media, got accustomed to having their own voice, spoke their minds. And you know, as we should have expected, showed that there was not just one big middle massive opinion, but a whole bunch of opinions coming from all different directions, though largely people separate into some species of right or left, and that has accentuated some of the tension in public discourse over the last 20 years. I personally think that those are both good things. I think there's a lot of sorting out to do, but to me, those are the two factors that have driven us to where we are now.
Barbara, I'll go to you next. You've obviously had a very public statement of recent with your own relationship with a very high profile mainstream media outlet, the National Post. So I'll let you speak to this, because you come at this as from a writer over many years and in many different publications.
Thank you. Yes, I was with the Post for almost 20 years, and I have very vivid memories of when I started out there. The atmosphere was quite electric, very ambitious, very confident, and very eager, you know, to be a voice for conservatives in Canada. A tremendous sense of mission. And I remember the early days, you know, when you had columnists like Mark Stein, who was totally outrageous, but very much loved by many of the Post readers. And he said stuff that obviously you can't say anymore, but it wasn't that it was hateful or anything like that. It was just he spoke his mind very freely. Those were also the days when I remember the Post sort of had a CBC watch, you know, this idea that the Post was going to be a sort of a watchdog for the hypocrisies and the ultra partisan voices coming from the left. So it was quite an exciting time. And by contrast, today is not exciting at all, because I would say it's a time. I would say the dominant emotion or the feeling that you sense in everybody is fear. Fear of being caught up in cancel culture. This is a very real thing. A lot of journalists have lost their jobs. A lot of editors have lost their job. And as Barry Weiss put it when she left the New York Times, you know, she was a senior editor, an opinions editor. She said, you know, it's as if Twitter were sitting on the editorial board. So yes, as Ken says, the internet, social media have amplified. It's a very riven culture that we live in now. And all those voices have been amplified by social media, and you can get canceled very quickly. I've been canceled a few times myself. I canceled myself finally in the end before I thought I was going to be canceled. So it is that kind of an atmosphere. There's one of fear, and many people have started to call it Orwellian, a sense of crime stop. You know, that's a word in newspeak where you stop yourself from saying that which you know will bring you punishment. So there is that mood. And I do think that the editors at the Post, my own editors, who, by the way, I never had any problem with personally, but I respect very much, and who were very supportive of me, but also had to be very careful, because internally the tail was wagging the dog by this time, or it certainly looked like it was the tail wagging the dog. And seemed to have lost control of the mission. So I do feel that is the general atmosphere nowadays, and it's a troubling one. So I could go on, but
Well, Barbara, we're going to talk more about how we confront that and deal with that as we go on in the discussion here. But I'll jump to Candice now, because Candice has been on both sides of the camera. We shared time together in the same organization for a number of years, and I think you've got some great perspective on this question, having had that experience on both sides.
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks, Troy, for organizing this. And I'll just sort of tail onto what Ken and Barbara said. I think it's absolutely true that social media has completely destroyed the concept of gatekeepers, because traditionally the mainstream media told you, this is the acceptable dialogue that we can have. This is the left, this is the right. These are the opinions that fit in between. And so, when social media came, the idea was this ultimate free speech bastion that everyone could have their opinion, everyone could broadcast themselves, everyone could have a fulsome debate, and it was supposed to enrich our democracy. And I think, to the horror of the elites in Silicon Valley who created these platforms, they realized that people don't really fall into the spectrum that they imagine, that really the spectrum of ideas that people have out there and that they want to talk about, they want to explore, is much, much broader. And so instead of celebrating that and working around the edges and trying to say debunk horrible conspiracies, they've had the opposite reaction, which is to really crack down on the speech that they disagree with. So, instead of a situation where we have more debate, more speech, we have people who are in these positions of power, whether they be the editors over at the National Post or the Silicon Valley giants, who are using their own powers to try to, again, point the conversation towards one specific direction and say, what, you're not allowed to have a dissenting view when it comes to coronavirus. You're not allowed to have a dissenting view when it comes to climate change. And I think that this is sort of a third thing that's happened, to add to Ken's two things that happened. The third thing is this cultural shift where people are saying, we are going to do everything we can to stop people from putting out opinions that we disagree with. And the range, instead of a wider range and a broader range of things we can talk about, it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower, to the point where conservatives can't even really put their mainstream opinions out there. You can't have a conservative columnist at the New York Times. You can hardly even have a conservative columnist at the National Post anymore. And I've seen it. I'm not inside a newsroom. I don't work in legacy media. I have a column in the Toronto Sun, but I'm sort of outside the organization looking in. But I can see that there is a huge amount of fear, to Barbara's point, that they don't want to be the next one canceled. And it's sort of ironic, because they're not relying on the mainstream ads that used to fuel journalism. They're relying on their own viewers. And I think they're doing a disservice when they're not giving the readers and the viewers what they want. And I think that is the reason why so many people are turning to alternative media and independent media to get their information, to get their facts, because more and more so that's a genuine relationship that they can trust. So that's sort of my 2 cents on it. I think it's a good thing that more people are turning towards independent media, because those media organizations are not constrained by the same kind of things that the established media is. And really, you can have a more interesting and fulsome discussion of the ideas. You're a lot freer in those platforms than under the traditional advertising models.
And we're going to get into that discussion in detail the next question. I'll go to Marc. Hi, Marc. Thanks for joining us. Marc's great because he's had a lot of different responsibilities in media over his career, but he's also served in the CRTC, which I think is a really cool addition to this discussion as well. So we're happy to have you, Marc, and I'll let you tackle that first question.
Thank you, Troy, and I do very much appreciate you inviting me to this. Yeah, you're right. I've bounced around quite a bit over the years. I've been at this for a while, and it's interesting. I just been listening to all the answers, and everybody's got a perspective that I think dovetails nicely into answering the question. I would agree certainly that the business model has changed and the social media has had a huge impact. From my perspective, I think the same thing that has happened to media has happened to other institutions, whether it's academia, the culture industries like the arts, big labor like unions, the environmental movement, right now through to the corporate boardrooms. And that's essentially the hijacking of these institutions by the radical left. J schools are just basically breeding grounds for hardcore leftists your typical social justice warriors looking to shape public opinion, not tell stories. Newsrooms are now populated with these people who are basically political activists, more interested in telling people what to think. And as a result, their content, frankly, is boring. It's predictable. It's uninteresting. And I think on a certain visceral level, consumers know and are not comfortable with it and are bailing out. So yeah, you have all this huge phenomenon around the creation of online content that Candice, of course, has been involved with, and many others. But you also have people saying, I don't feel good about what I'm consuming on CTV anymore, where I spent 15 years. I don't feel good about what I see on CTV now, which has seen, or CBC rather, which has seen their viewing audience shrink to nothing, to the point where they had to get rid of and cancel their local newscasts. I've seen people, I've been in, and frankly been alarmed when I see content and I see stories coming up on their websites, and I think, well, where did this come from? And I follow it, and I see that the source came from Media Matters, and this is on the Global News website, and I think, what? And, I have to rub my eyes here, and I see the same story on Media Matters, lifted, tweaked a little bit, and Canadianized, and then poof, it appears on the Global News website. And so I think at some point I realized I'm in the wrong place. They're not doing what I used to do. And so this is one of the things that's happened that, to their credit, people have hijacked essentially these newsrooms, and they have no respect for the people consuming their content. As I said, they're more interested in pushing through a narrative. They're not interested in entertaining people. They're interested in catering to their own little cliques. I mean, that has been going on for many years. Newsrooms, you could say, have been liberal for decades and decades, but it moved from being kind of liberal left to being hardcore, and so they want to tell you what to think. And as far as gatekeepers are concerned, sadly now, big tech wants to play that role. And that's why people are deplatformed. That's why YouTube videos are banned. That's why people get shadow banned on Twitter. And so, unfortunately, we've gone from one group of gatekeepers to another. And so this has been happening over the decades. And sadly, a lot of conservatives, even conservative reporters, journalists, have been, frankly, so busy doing their own thing that they haven't really noticed, and I think reacted soon enough to what has happened, to the point where now the alarms are going off, and people are thinking, oh no, what are we going to do? We got to do something. Well, we should have done something and started talking about this stuff many years ago. Better late than never, mind you. And I'm not saying it's too late to change the cultures, but sadly, I think, and maybe not so sadly, some of these media organizations are finished. They're done. They're going to lose. They're going to continue hemorrhaging viewers, continue hemorrhaging consumers who don't want this crap. And sadly, the people who have been in the newsroom and seen it happen, they don't want to rock the boat because they're afraid. So from my take, that's what I've seen over the years. And, I'll do what I can to change it. But that's my read on the situation, for what it's worth.
Okay, well, let's transition into that, because I think that's where we want to spend most of our time having this conversation today. What is and what has been the conservative response to this over the last number of years? And that also talks about the trends in journalism more broadly. So it's true that we have a challenging environment, but it's also true that there's more opportunities that exist out there. We see podcasts. Joe Rogan, for example, comes to mind. Independent news sites, citizen journalists, activist journalists. So let's talk briefly about these opportunities as they pertain to conservatives. But I'd also argue that there are still gatekeepers, or gatekeepers to reform. To use my friend Gordon Gibson's quote, there's government bodies. There's the CRTC. but there's also journalism associations, and one that Candice will be familiar with, the Leaders Debate Commission, which you could maybe talk about that story, Candice. And of course, there's also the tech giants, which has just come up in this discussion. So it seems too that the entire definition of journalism itself is increasingly a debate topic. You know, we see what just happened in the Alberta legislature this past week. The Journalism Association Legislative Press Gallery has voted to ban Rebel News. And in response to that, Post Media has removed their reporters from the press gallery because they believe that this vote removes diversity in the press gallery. So that's partly a debate too about what the nature of journalism is going forward. So let's have a bit of I know that's a lot of material to wrap up there, but let's have a bit of a discussion around that, especially in terms of the direction that it's going for us that believe in these conservative values. So maybe Candice, I'll probably start with you because this is probably aimed most to you in terms of the work you've done over the last few years.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, we're in a really challenging situation just because media is changing so much. And again, I think it's a great thing. You know, there used to be the sort of gatekeepers or the distribution channel issues where you had to go tell your story. You know, Troy, you mentioned that we both used to work at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Back then, you had to go to the mainstream media to get your story out. But now you don't. You know, you can reach your own audience through Facebook, through YouTube and your own email list, and you don't need those gatekeepers. So in that regard, it's great. But when it comes to sort of dealing with the traditional barriers and the establishment still at play, that's where we see the challenge. And I think it's sort of absurd in Alberta. I mean, I guess it's better because back in 2016, it was the Notley government themselves saying, you know, we're going to determine who is a journalist. At least now it's the Alberta Press Gallery getting to say who is and who isn't a journalist. But of course, you know, again, this is a situation where you have a dying industry, which is the establishment media, and they're the ones who get to determine who is and who isn't one of their competitors. I mean, what incentive would they possibly have to say, yeah, let's open it up and let all the bloggers and all the independent guys come and steal our lunch? You know, there's still going to be that inherent protectionism, and that's sort of what's going on. I think some folks are familiar with what happened to me and my organization, True North. We wanted to cover the federal election 2019. You know, we have a website, a journalism website. We post news reports every day. We do podcasts, interviews, documentaries, investigative reports. We basically check all the boxes of what is journalism, and we hire professional journalists. So I had Andrew Lawton, who is a seasoned radio host. He'd actually interviewed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau before in his capacity as a chorus radio host out in London, Ontario. But as soon as he came and worked for True North, all of a sudden, all of these you know, official gatekeepers or establishment folks in the Parliamentary Press Gallery, the Leaders Debates Commission, which was created by the Trudeau government, and the Liberal Party themselves, they all said, no, Andrew's not a journalist. He cannot attend official events in his capacity with True North. And so we sort of tried to push back. We tried to go to events anyway. We did what we could. And then it wasn't until the Leaders Debates Commission banned us and gave us a decision saying, no, we couldn't come to the debates. They let us know on a Friday afternoon before the Monday debate, giving us no recourse, no real explanation as to why we were rejected. So we took them to court. We filed an emergency injunction with a federal court in Toronto. And remarkably, we won. The same thing happened to Ezra Levant in Rebel News. And so he joined our injunction. We did it first, then he joined together. So they coupled our cases together. And we won, which I think was a huge victory. We got to send our reporters and we got to say, look, the government doesn't get to behave in this sort of backroom behavior where they get to make decisions without any transparency. And we're still fighting in court because we're trying to get more disclosure as to what actually happened and how the decisions were made. But I guess it's sort of just a story of how you can push back against these sort of arbiters. But you know, again, at the end of the day, we're still not a member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. They have their own barriers. You know, the Rebel's not included in Alberta, again, because the barriers that are created by legacy journalists. And I'll just say one final thing to kind of echo what the point that Marc made in his last interjection there. is just basically that the legacy media is so narrow. They're so afraid of, saying the wrong thing, stepping on someone's toe, that really they're becoming boring and so monotone, like the same opinions. Doesn't matter whether you pick up Globe and Mail, Maclean's, a lot of the post-media papers, they're just saying the same thing, and it's so narrow. And given, again, the wide range of perspectives and opinions and ideas out there, I think that they're losing their own audiences just because they're not really keeping up with the kind of demand from outside people that are more interesting, that are bringing a different perspective. And I think that it doesn't matter what kind of barriers they put up and how much they fight. Eventually, people are going to go where they find interest, and they're going to go to reporters that they trust, independent people, or just journalists that they find credible. That the sort of labels of the mainstream establishment media won't really mean much, and they don't really mean much going forward. Regardless of how they may try to stop groups like True North from entering. At the end of the day, the audience gets to decide, and I think that more and more people are going towards that independent route.
Right. Well, hopefully the trend is improving. I mean, Notley appointed this journalist Boyd to investigate this in 2016, and it's interesting the conclusion that came out of that. She said media organizations should not be denied accreditation on the basis of point of view. Accreditation must reflect evolving reality of new media, which is exactly what you talk about. And maybe on that point, I'll go to Barbara next on this discussion.
Yes, this is one that I feel quite keenly about. I don't think that there should be these kind of gatekeepers at all. It's you're asking for. These become power trips when you have journalists, organizations deciding who and who isn't a journalist. Obviously, they're going to go with what they think is their idea of a trusted, or who has the right opinions, or who has the wrong opinions. The press gallery, they approve the People's Daily of China. And I'm sure they don't even think twice about it, because that's obviously a real newspaper, right? It happens to be from a communist country and is totally run by the government and totally censored by so if you were going to ban any journalistic entity, it would be, it should be an entity that is from, that is run by the government and not free. These are not free journalists. So you want the most free expression that you can. I remember in 2011, Quebec made a gambit in this direction, trying to enforce who was going to be a journalist and it was going to be regulated. And they put out this thing called in 2009 called the Payette report, named after the person who did the research. And they floated the idea that they would have, the Quebec Press Council would have power to decide who was and who was not a journalist. And that filled me with real fear, because in 2006, the Quebec Press Council had censured me. They're just they have no power. They're an honorary organization, but they censored me they didn't like an opinion column that I wrote. And I remember very well when I got notice of their censure, it was sent to my door. It looked very much like a subpoena. I was kind of green in those days, so I got very panicky, and they sent the same thing to the National Post. And I remember I spoke to my son and I said, look, they've sent me this thing, and it looks like, it looked like I had to go to court over it. And he just laughed and said, we're in Ontario, they have no power over anybody, so relax, like nothing's going to happen. But it was very scary for me, because that was the first time I'd ever had any interaction with a council, a press council, and I thought they did have power. But they did have the power to make everybody that sat on that council very nervous about expressing any opinion that would annoy the other people on the council. And if you had given that council the power they wanted, I would not have been accredited as a journalist in Quebec. I'd be the first one off their list, because I had criticized Quebec about, it doesn't matter. But anyways, it was sort of a little moment of an affair called, Quebecistan. It was a moment. Anyways, off topic. But anyways, I just want to say that you can't You can't be having, especially if they're getting subsidies. Anytime you start getting subsidies, you start becoming a silent partner of the government, and you can't have that. So for Rebel or True North to be excluded from a press gallery that admits the People's Daily from China is something that I would laugh about if it weren't so serious. So I'll leave it at that.
Marc, I'll come to you on this. I'm going to change the direction just a little bit, though, because while you say that legacy media is dying in some ways, they still have massive audiences. And I think the other point to make here is that, you know, a lot of these conservative alternatives are talking about editorial, they're doing investigative journalism, the kind of stuff that Candice is doing. But I also think that a lot of people just tune in to see what the score was or see the highlights from the Canucks St. Louis game last night. They're getting their entertainment, they're getting their weather and all of that. So that seems to me to be a big gap. And I know you and I have talked about this separately in terms of getting the average viewer who's just checking in on news, sports, and weather. That still remains a powerful influence with a lot of legacy media reaching huge numbers. And what does that mean for small C conservatives?
Okay, well, I don't know, huge numbers. I may differ with you on a certain count, and I know that there's been some analysis done that suggests that everybody's watching these things, but just so we're clear, CTV National can get maybe 1 million people a night. It used to get a lot more, but these days, on an average week or an average night, they get maybe 1 million households. Between CBC, Global, National, and maybe City, they might get another 1.5 million. So we're talking about maybe 2.5 to 3 million households watching a national newscast every night. I mean, we have what, 14 million households in Canada, something like that, maybe more. That's a small percentage of people tuning in to newscasts. I mean, the national, I mean, their audience used to be, it was nothing for them to get 2 million people. Now they don't even register on the Numeris ratings. They get 250,000 or somewhere in that range. Global maybe get 500,000. I mean, we're not talking about that huge. People used to tune in the national newscasts are no longer doing so in the same numbers. Some of them are. So, yeah, I mean, people are still listening to radio on their drive-in, and they're getting their news peripherally. So we've discussed this, the fact that, you know, people wanting the Leaf score or the Canucks score in your case, you know, are also getting their snide remarks about Trump by the newscaster, or, you know, something else about. So they're getting I think they're getting their politics in that way. You know what I'm saying? It's almost like through osmosis. I'm sorry, did I lose track of your question? I was kind of expecting to answer the other one, but you're asking me what we should do about it?
Right. I mean, I guess maybe the question too is do we just write off legacy media as conservatives and just continue down our own channels? Because I know you and I have talked about this subject.
I mean, I've ripped legacy media, just so we're clear. I work in AM radio, so it doesn't get any more legacy than that. Which, frankly, I'm starting to think that AM radio, even though it's a regulated platform, it actually, in certain respects, is starting to develop more freedom than a lot of what I'm seeing on Twitter and elsewhere, and on Google, where I've been shadow banned, I know, on Twitter more than once. And so I'm starting to get the sense that in an odd way, I'm feeling more free. I know it sounds weird, more free on AM radio. There's certain words, obviously, that I can't say. I've got to live within the bounds of acceptable radio language. And, you know, I hear about it if I use a word, or if, you know, the F words, you know, ends up on the radio cast through a clip or something like that. You know, I'm spoken to about that. Everybody's sensitive about that. But in terms of my opinion, I think I'm feeling pretty free about that. So I think conservatives should absolutely not give up on so-called legacy media. But I think the way I see it is there needs to be a partnership between somebody in legacy media like I do in my show. Right now, I think I'm creating a template for the future of conservative media. And that's going to sound big-headed, but I really believe that. You know, my 2 hours, you know, in my 2 hours, I can have a Spencer Fernando on my show, or I can have a Joe Oliver on my show. I've asked Candice to be on my show. So far, she has rebuffed me, but I'm not quitting. You know, I'm not going to give up, Candice. Or an Andrew Lawton on my show. So I've asked people from both legacy, you know, or a Brian Lilly, you know, he's been on the show, or Tom Korski over at Blacklocks, who has an online news portal. So I think there's a huge potential there between people in the legacy media area who have programs, who have a certain platform there, who can build relationships and get those people on the air. And then, you know, if they want me to appear on their online show, I'm happy to do that. So it's quid pro quo. I promote SpencerFernando.com, and Spencer can come on my show and give me his opinion and provide content for me on my show. And so that relationship should be more and more common, but I'm just not sure it is. And part of the reason is that there's a cultural difference. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I was going to mention this before you threw me a curveball there, Troy, and it's all good. But the fact is, the people in legacy media, I know them. I've worked in that field. I came out of that world. They have a cultural view of the world that if you didn't go to this J school, then you didn't learn CP style or CBC style. You write a certain way. I mean, how can I, you know, look at David Menzies and what he just did to Patrick Brown and think that's journalism? You know, that's not the way we would do it. You know, and how did he wrote the story in a certain way? You know, that style doesn't lend itself to CP style. That could never fly on the CBC website. You know, it just breaks all these rules, and they're uncomfortable with that. You know, they're never going to feel comfortable with that because that's not what they believe. And so they're going to always look down on people in legacy media because they just don't, not only are they different in terms of their attitudes, but their style is radically different from what these guys are doing at CBC, CTV, and the rest of them. So that's why that divide exists. I'm trying to break that divide. What I'm saying is, as a conservative-minded individual in legacy media, I think let's work with people. Let's work together. You know, we can break through the Liberal Party, that mind-numbing liberal screen, that lens that so much of our news is seen through. We can break through that if we work together rather than work against each other, or, you know, work in competition with one another.
Troy, can I make a quick point? I just want to follow up two things, Marc. First, I'm totally happy to come on your radio show. I blame that on having a baby and not corresponding properly, but I'm going to come on your show. And second, I just want to say that the establishment media in this regard are such hypocrites, because it's true. They'll look at the Rebel or they look at True North and they'll say, these guys aren't real journalists because they do X, Y, and Z. And I read that letter from the Association of Journalists. It was also published in the National Observer. And I just found it so hypocritical because they do those things too. You know, they say, okay, well, the reason that Rebel isn't real journalists is because they go to political rallies and they take a position, whereas a real journalist is not supposed to do that. Well, I'm sorry. I just watched Black Lives Matter protests explode all over North America. And I watched establishment journalists take a position and show their support and say, these protesters are right, this is why. And so the idea that the establishment journalists are these completely neutral, perfect journalists is just not true. And I think to one of your earlier points that you made, Marc, it's because of this cultural leftism that's really just taken over the mindset of these journalists. So they really believe that they can be left-wing activists, they can be anti-Trump activists or anti-Andrew Scheer activists while also doing their job, because somehow they're protecting democracy by protecting us from these evil conservative ideas and people.
Okay. Ken, we haven't forgotten about you.
I'm still here.
You're still here. We covered that question covered a lot of ground. So wherever you want to go with it, either the question on do conservatives seed the legacy media, or sort of the nature on next steps for people that want to advocate these diverse ideas as Candice just talked about.
I don't see it as simple as legacy media versus the new entrants, and I'm very supportive of the new entrants, but I think there's also very interesting things going on in some of the legacy media. You look at what's happened with the New York Times over the last year or two. First of all, it's discovered that its future relies on its circulation revenue, its subscriptions from average readers, and they have about 6 million of them now, which is probably 3-4 times more than it had when it was a newspaper with healthy advertising. So they are much more in tune with their readers than they have been in the past. And that, I think, is one of the things that's moving them further to the left. At the same time, you're starting to see, I think, a bit of a reaction at the Wall Street Journal, which is also depending on its readers more and more for its revenue. And it's starting to be a little bit more vocal on the right. It came out very strongly against the things that were happening at the New York Times recently. I think that some of the US publications, particularly the big ones that rely on big subscription numbers, are starting to figure this out, that you got to take a side, that the mushy middle is not really a good place to be. Canadian newspapers, I think, are way behind on that score, and most of them are still caught in the middle, and as others have said, really afraid to take a position anywhere, afraid to misstep, afraid to alienate or make themselves targets, and haven't quite figured a way forward, nor have they figured out a new business model, and none of them have much in the way of circulation revenue. So I hope some of them figure that out as time goes on. I'm not sure that they will, but in the meantime, I think there will be a lot of new opportunities for organizations like Candice's and some of the others that have sprung up in the last several years, and I hope we see them survive as a permanent challenge to the gatekeepers. And as far as all of those associations, press galleries, press councils, press associations, they've always been useless. And I think Candice's group and Barbara and all of the rest of you are far better off outside them than you are within them. All they do is drag you to some soft and reader unfriendly consensus on what is and what isn't journalism, what isn't news. And I don't think that's healthy as well. That the whole explosion of social media and blogging, podcasting, all these things that have happened over the last 20 years has been just a wonderful blossoming of democratic conversation, allowing everybody an entry into the debate, and that's something that ought to be encouraged, and we should open it up still further rather than try and keep your foot in the door against all of these new journalism organizations that are coming out.
Okay,
Can I just, okay.
Go ahead, Barbara, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I was so very impressed with what the Wall Street Journal did. I talked before about the tail wagging the dog, meaning that the staffers feel that they have and this is a spillover from what they learned at university. Everybody thought that this ridiculously far left identity politics stuff and social justice warrior stuff was going to stay on the campus. But then a few years ago, it spilled out because they graduated, but they were told, your job is to be an activist, not your job is to learn or your job is to become an educated person. It's your job is to be an activist. So they've gone into the publishing houses and the newspapers and everything else, and they feel it is their job to tell their bosses what should be the policies and what should be. So it's been working. Publishing houses have canceled books that they were going to put out because their staffers rebelled. And as Ken mentioned, the New York Times, not only are they pandering to their subscribers, to the new subscribers and the far left ones, but they're pandering to their own staff, and they not only fired an editor that was the staffers weren't happy with, but they said our new policy will be, anything that you feel uncomfortable about. They've also admitted that the telling the news as it is, or factually, is no longer their mandate. Their 1619 project, which redefines American history as having started in 1619 as a slavocracy. They admitted that the facts in that project are wrong, many of them, but that's not their job. Their job is to be activists. So the Wall Street Journal did do a big pushback. In their note to their readers, they said, look, we're the bosses. Editorial and news is going to remain separate. That's what it was always supposed to be. And that's what's going to continue to be at the Wall Street Journal. And if you don't like it, they pretty well said to their staffers, if you don't like it, leave. The reason they could do that is because they're the owners of that newspaper have deep pockets. And I wonder if that was the sort of thing I said to myself, gee, wouldn't that have been nice if at the National Post, when Rex Murphy was they tried to sort of throw him under the bus. They didn't quite, but they got a compromise thing by having apologies made all around to the staffers who didn't like his opinion column a few months ago on systemic racism. Wouldn't it have been nice if they said, if you don't like, editorial and news are two different things, then editorial, columnists say what is their opinion. If you don't like that, maybe you should be at another company. And I would have really liked it. I think all you have to do is fire the ringleader on these things. Fire one person, say, is anybody else unhappy with the direction here, with the management? Because if you are, so that Wall Street thing gave me real, that gave me a real sense of hope that if even they, if one newspaper could do it, then maybe other newspapers would take heart from it. I think that was the healthy response to taking orders from below. There's something very wrong when you upend the paradigm of management and staff to that degree.
I'm watching time. There's a lot of really good questions coming in, but the number one question that came in when we put out that we were having this conversation, I have to put it to you, and I'm going to ask for brief responses on it. It's not just regulations and regulations as they relate to government, but it's also the whole question of direct funding, in particular the CBC. It's a very different world from 1936 when the CBC was formed. It's getting $1.3 billion, and now we're actually subsidizing media outlets. So comment on that, and or maybe to cut to the chase, we are if a new government, if a conservative government were to come in place, what is the one policy that they might be able to undertake that would improve the media landscape in the country? And perhaps it's related to these funding questions or something in terms of regulatory, but I want to put that question to you and sort of do a quick around the board here. Marc, maybe I'll start with you so that we can at least get to one question at the end here. So I'll ask you to try and go quickly.
Well, are you talking about, you're asking about the CBC and what the government can do? Okay.
Well, or the subsidies. If a conservative government came in and could do one policy, I know the leadership candidates have talked about this stuff, but from your perspective, if you could wave a magic wand, what is the one thing that people listening to this might be pushing to say, we can improve media in this country by X policy?
Okay, here's a 30-second answer that deals with the CBC issue as well as helping media, like, for instance, Candice's operation, True North, Rebel, whomever. You can take the CBC, and rather than getting rid of it, scrapping it all together, because they have enormous archives, it is a fabulous history of Canada, right? They've got amazing stuff over there in terms of information, history, okay? So what I would do is slash about, I would say 75% of their budget by getting rid of the editorial side of their operation. So all the people who decide what you should think. So they'll take an event like a news conference, and they'll tell you what you think, what you should think about that. I'd get rid of them. All the 90% of the commentator, in fact, all the commentators, all the executives, the highly paid people in the boardrooms. I would keep the archival area section of the CBC, and I would keep the tech people. I would basically take that part of their operation, and I would say, keep doing what you're doing, keep chronicling Canada, but make all that content available 100% to all Canadians, regardless of who wants it. So if Candice needs some video of the Meech Lake reports that were done in the early 90s or late 1980s, then somebody at CBC makes that content available to her. So that's the job of the CBC. It's free of charge. Here's the stuff, and she gets to do whatever she wants with that on her media platform. And then any educational institution gets to take whatever content is available at CBC. Nobody, it's not a proprietary type of thing. They have it at their disposal simply by asking for it, simply by virtue of being a taxpayer in Canada. And then the other side that CBC would continue doing is recording and being a chronicler of news conferences. Anybody if Pierre Poilievre has a news conference, you shoot that, you air it on your platforms. That's what I would do with the CBC.
Bit of a CPAC. Ken,
Yeah.
I'll come to you on this. And of course, one of the challenges for the private sector has been, in essence, competing with your own tax dollars when it comes to the CBC. I mean, they're not, CBC is not subject to paywalls and other challenges that a lot of other private sector outlets face in trying to monetize their efforts.
Yeah, I don't think the CBC should be competing for advertising dollars with private media. I don't have a single solution for the CBC, but I will say this. It's about time that Conservatives did develop a policy, not only for CBC, but for cultural policy in Canada, because they've never had one. They completely ignore it. And, during things like a leadership campaign, someone will come out and say we should, abolish the CBC, or we should abolish CBC Canada. And then when they get in office, they see the polls and they find out that, 70% of Canadians value the it's actually higher, as 80% of Canadians value the CBC, even if they don't listen to the damn thing. And, it would be very unpopular to start hacking away at it. But useful, constructive reform that, took the CBC out of the way of private media entities and found a way for it to actually serve an important purpose. If the Conservatives could come up with a policy, I think that would be really welcome, because otherwise they're just going to talk about it during the leadership campaign, and like the Harper government and every government before that has done, they'll just ignore it when they get to office, and it'll continue to limp along and be one of the biggest annoyances to the Conservative community in Canada.
Barbara, I'll come to you next on this.
Yeah, I would definitely reduce the CBC's. I do think, I know that the polls show a strong, much stronger than in the US, trust in public stations, and they do but I would keep the CBC radio strong. I think that is actually very helpful to people and expats who are abroad. Keep that and radically diminish the TV arm, and certainly have no competition with, and doing TV shows that they should not be competing with private stations at all. So, but I think that subsidies in general are a terrible thing. And, in France, just to give you an example of the difference between when independent media are independent and media are not. In France, they have a heavy subsidization policy. And last year, they subsidized to the tune of over €1 billion for their media there. That is the highest in any democracy on earth. But their newspapers are not respected. The highest circulation figure for Le Monde was 400,000 in 2004. It's now down to 300,000. And a single newspaper in the UK, which has approximately the same population as France, which is independent, a single newspaper there has more circulation than the entire newspapers in France altogether, because they all have a homogenous quality in France, and they all toe the party line, and it's all they're silent partners of the government. And when you take money from the government, you become their communications arm, and it's wink wink, and you're afraid to be too critical, and so you mute your criticism, and you also don't pile up on each other because you know you're all taking money. It's a very insidious thing, and there's no disclosure. When I write something about the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedom, I say, and full disclosure, I sit on their board, but you don't see any of these media people saying, well, here's my opinion, and I take money from the government. Here's my opinion about the government, and I take money from the government. Well, maybe that should be part of the disclosure if they're going to talk about the government, those that take and those that don't take, so that, Candice can say, and I don't take money from the government when she criticizes the government. Those are a few ideas.
Well, Barbara, it's not just that, I take money from the government. It's like the sole job would not exist. Like the government gives them grants to hire brand new reporters to focus on niche issues like climate change, and those jobs would not exist. So it's not even like, 10% of my salary comes from the government. It's like, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for what these guys are doing. Sure, I'll just jump into my answer. I'll just say quickly, Professor Lydia Milan had a really excellent piece in C2C Journal looking through media regulation and putting forward some ideas around sort of copyright laws and getting rid of some of these subsidies that I encourage everyone to read, because it came up with really good solutions that's far more policy oriented than I could come up with right now. But I'll just say that I think it's so absurd that the CBC competes with legacy newspapers in creating, this whole online CBC News, providing the news for free to Canadians, when all of these newspapers are trying to condition Canadians to pay for their news, to say, if you want to read the news, if you want to read these stories, if you want to read these investigative reports and opinion pieces, pay $5 a month or whatever. When you have CBC kind of providing the same content free of charge to Canadians, so why would Canadians go to the Globe and Mail and pay when they could get the same sort of content for free from the CBC? And I think that's a major reason why Trudeau chose to go towards the media bailout, the newspaper $600 million fund for journalists, is because they were trying to compete against the CBC. So, and the increase in CBC budget that came under Trudeau. My solution would be to privatize the whole thing and just get rid of it, good riddance. But I do see, some merit in Marc's points about archives and about news conferences, and also, Ken's point about the popularity of the CBC. Maybe it could be more like the NPR model in the US, where it's small and niche and they do interesting sort of programming and radio. But to me, the biggest problem with the CBC is that they dominate the press conferences. So you have, more than half of the journalists covering Trudeau, any of his events, are from the CBC. They're going to set the agenda. They're going to determine what kinds of questions are going to be asked and set the tone. And so when you have this, large portion of very left-wing journalists pushing their own agenda, leading the discussion, leading the media, it has all kinds of other unintended consequences. And it's really, really problematic for the media landscape.
We had a lot of really good questions, and I sincerely apologize, but we had a good discussion, a detailed discussion. We're going to have to leave it there to stay on time, unless anybody very quickly has any sort of projects or anything they want to share with our audience before we sign off. Okay. With that, thank you all for participating. Thank you to our panelists. Colin, sorry I didn't get to you this time. This recording will be available on our website, Canada Strong and Free Network, and we'll be back next month, and I will have the topic to you here in the next while. As always, feel free to contact us if you have any ideas. So thank you all for participating, and we'll look forward to seeing you all back. Bye for now.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Bye.